to Medicare for All and the Future of Labor. I'm Crystal Ball. I host a program called Rising on Hill TV with a co-host, Sagar. We do a sort of left-right pro-worker and pro-working class show. And I'm really excited about the panelists that we have today, three women that I admire incredibly. But it's my first time getting to speak with each of you. Let me just do a brief introduction, then we can jump right into the conversation. First up, we have Ada Briseño. She's a co-president of Unite Here Local 11, representing over 30,000 hospitality workers in Southern California and Arizona. She's also chair of the Orange County Democratic Party. Welcome, Ada. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for hearing our voices today.
Of course. We also have Shireen Horazek. She's the president of Ask Me Local 3800, representing 3,000 clerical workers at the University of Minnesota. And I know your local has a history of standing in solidarity with workers, and we're involved in the protest movements for justice for George Floyd. So great to have you too, Shireen.
Really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Of course. And finally, we have Cynthia Finney. She's president of the Maine AFL-CIO and also a member of IBEW Local 1837. And Cynthia, I know up in Maine, you all have actually been really leaders in the labor campaign for single payer since 2009. So thank you so much. It's so great to meet you and so great to have you.
So pleased to be here and looking forward to moving this conversation forward into the next step.
Yeah, of course. So I think this is a kind of a perfect time to have this conversation because on the one hand, the past year, it's been kind of an important one and a very disturbing one in terms of healthcare. Obviously, with the coronavirus crisis, the utter failure of employer-based health insurance, I think, has been manifest for many. You can see in public opinion polling, support for Medicare for all, support for single-payer healthcare is perhaps at an all-time high and has seen an increase, not just in support among liberal Democrats, but across the board with independents and some Republicans as well. Cynthia, could you just talk a little bit to set the stage here about the evolution in views among the broader American public, but also within the labor movement around Medicare for all?
Sure. As a federation, our organization has supported at least some form of single payer for a very long time. But I think as people have talked about this, one of the places that brought us to this current position where we are now is we started a few years ago, maybe 3 now, doing a listening project amongst our members about healthcare because it was clearly an issue that people cared about. We know it's the thing that eats up the most time at the bargaining table for most unions when they're negotiating contracts. We know it's an issue for all workers when choosing jobs, when losing jobs. And as we did our listening project, just talking with people, fairly open-ended questions about healthcare, they were all ending up with people feeling like we needed something that was more secure, that they didn't lose when things changed for them. And I feel that nationally, as we've watched the conversation, that it's been a similar evolution. And as you just indicated with the COVID crisis, that's catapulted so many people into realizing how fragile the protections that they have, such as they are, actually are for most people.
Yeah. And Ada, I see you nodding your head. I can't imagine with your members working in hospitality, what they've faced and struggled with this year. Just speak to us a little bit about that experience.
So our 32,000 workers here in the bulk of Southern California and also in Arizona are about 90% laid off right now. So folks, you know, we have very few people in airports and there's nothing in convention center, nothing in arenas, very, very, very few folks working in the hotels. So not only are they getting sick, but they're dying. So we see that, especially in California, you know, our members or Latinos actually are succumbing to the virus at 2.5 times the rate as our white counterparts. So it's devastating. And on top of that, they lost their jobs, obviously. So they're having a very difficult time keeping a roof over their heads and, you know, also for their health care. And that's the last thing you want to go is your healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. So we have been getting innovative and thoughtful about how to keep our members, in our healthcare plan. So folks that are, our members that are in our healthcare plan, we've been successful for the last 10 months or so in keeping their healthcare. But it's been one car caravan at a time, one protest at a time to make sure that employers keep up with the healthcare, right? But can you imagine how many of our non-union workers are, in our industry, their kids, their family members are going without healthcare? It's despicable, right? We've got to find a better way here. This is the most basic need that we, that as human beings we have is our health, and we need to take care of that. And so, I can just imagine, I can just imagine a perfect place where, unions can fight for, to end discrimination of all types in the workplace if we didn't have to struggle so much with healthcare. I gotta say, I got into this movement, over 30 years ago to make sure that we were putting more money in our members' pocket. But I gotta say, I've been very successful in putting money in healthcare companies instead of our members' pockets.
Yeah.
And that's devastating. That's very difficult for our members. They stand up and fight, and they're successful in their healthcare. But pensions are difficult, wages are difficult. So we're, it's a difficult place.
Yeah. And Shireen, speak to your experience over the past year. Have you seen people's minds change over the year? We had this very fraught Democratic primary debate that feels like a lifetime ago at this point, where healthcare was really center stage. And, ultimately, even though there was a lot of support for Medicare for all within the primary, obviously a candidate was chosen who didn't back that. But now we've had this entire year of seeing what it looks like when you have people have insecurity in their healthcare. We don't even know what the fallout is going to look like, the number of millions of people who are going to have to declare medical bankruptcy for no reason other than that they happen to get sick during a pandemic. Have you seen minds changed over the course of the year and what we've all lived through?
Absolutely. I think, healthcare is a fundamental human right. And around the world, almost every country has some type of universal health care, except in the United States, where health insurance is something that is tied to your job, or you're forced to seek it on the exchange. And what that means is that people have come to accept poor quality health insurance or poor quality health care at high costs. And I'm actually really fortunate that I grew up in a union household, and I saw the difference between having a high quality health insurance plan when my father was a Teamster. My mother actually was diagnosed with cancer and was able to live for 3 or 4 years longer than they had projected because of the quality of care that she had due to my father's health insurance. Roll ahead a few years, my father, the company he worked for closed down. He lost his job as a 50-year-old man. He was not able to get another unionized job in the trucking industry, went into business for himself, didn't have insurance, was ended up in the emergency room one day because he was having tingly feelings in his legs, and 7 weeks later died of cancer. With hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. And so for me, the issue of healthcare and whether or not you have it provided by your employer, whether or not we view it as a fundamental human right, has always been a really passionate issue. Over the past year, I've seen folks in rural Minnesota, folks in the metro area, folks who are in non-unionized positions who have not historically supported the issue of Medicare for all, really come around to it, or articulate it more. I think people are really committed in general to the idea of having healthcare access for all, but they've become convinced that it's going to cost them. And I think what we've seen with the pandemic is that the cost is really the cost is the way the system works now. When people are afraid to go in and get tested because they're not sure whether or not get tested for COVID, they're not sure whether or not they're going to be able to pay the costs of healthcare, what will happen if they end up in the emergency room, et cetera. And so I think that there's been a real mind shift in the thinking around healthcare, and I think a much greater support for again, a view that healthcare is a fundamental right that we all deserve.
Yeah. And I mean, Cynthia, we saw estimates of maybe as many as 12 million Americans who've lost their health insurance because they were laid off during this year. So it makes it sort of insane, this idea of like, oh my God, well, people will lose their health insurance if you go to Medicare for all. No. The status quo right now is millions of people losing their health insurance every single year. Speak to that, and also speak to, look, I mean, not all unions and not all union leaders support Medicare for all, because they feel like, okay, this is something that, I can use in my negotiations. This is something that I can use so that workers see the benefits also of organizing in a union. Talk about that divide and how that relates to, the view of the labor movement overall.
Sure. And that is a really challenging question. And before I go to that, the first thing you were talking about, the people losing their insurance, just to put a slightly more human face on sort of that generic thing, I was horrified in a meeting with one of our Senate candidates when with some union members, one of whom is a nurse who delivers babies. And she relayed her experience that there had been an uptick in her hospital of early inducements of labor. And when they do those, they always have a reason for it. And she said that they were seeing a great increase in people inducing labor because they were about to lose their health insurance, because they knew that they were going to lose their job. This was in the early times of the COVID. And yes, many members, many unions offer, it's one of the attractions that they can offer to new members. One of the benefits is that they've negotiated excellent healthcare plans that are available for union members, and also that union members can carry from job to job if they're in that kind of a union. Construction unions typically work this way. And so that's a really interesting internal discussion, but I think a lot of, even for them, they're seeing, for many of them, it's difficult. They have to still compete with non-union contractors who don't have to necessarily offer health insurance, and that health insurance package, because it's typically good insurance, can add a lot to the bid that a union contractor has to put on a job. And so it's a weighing of those things in terms of the full support of security for the workers and for the members. And so it's an important discussion. It's one we're having. It's one of the things to work out as we go forward. There's complete agreement on the fact that people should have health insurance and health coverage, excuse me. They should have access to health care, and it should be affordable for them. So.
Yeah, to pick up on that point, because I think there's also just a sort of broader philosophical question of what is the purpose of a union, right? I mean, obviously the purpose, first and foremost, advocate for the interest of the members, but there's also a sense of, okay, we're not just advocating for our members, but we're advocating for the interest of all working people. And I think that's, to me, that's kind of the operating divide here between really clearly understanding that it's good for everybody if we have Medicare for all. Healthcare is a human right. Every single person in the country deserves to have that just basic floor under them that every other developed world country has been able to offer, versus the focus just solely on the membership, as important as that is.
Well, I think that's... Go ahead, Cynthia.
I was just going to say the word floor, that when the floor is raised, it benefits everyone, even if your union's at negotiating table, we're starting from a more even place. Ada, sorry about that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No, I just think that solidarity means taking care of each other. As a whole, we've got to care about, not only our union members, but people in the industry that we represent. We have to care about our fellow Americans. And, there's so much more that we need to offer that we should be offering to our members as a labor movement. We can be so much more involved in politics as well. and have our footprint more dedicated to politics. I believe that if we had Medicare for all, we can make sure that we're integrating our membership into politics and making sure that Democrats move forward. If we weren't so focused on healthcare, we can look at so many different parts of our society that I believe that we have an obligation as a labor movement, as a whole, to uplift. But as it is, whether it's pandemic or not pandemic, so much of our resources have gone to healthcare. Endless. I mean, I've gotten arrested 6 times for healthcare.
Wow.
And again, and then all the money goes to the large, Kaiser and all these other healthcare folks, and it's not a good way to do it. We've got to be leading. The labor movement has a place in leading America, in my opinion.
Yeah. What do you think of that divide, Shireen?
Well, I would agree with what Ada and Cynthia said. One of the phrases that the labor movement uses is that an injury to one is an injury to all. We're not interested in building a company town where you get a job and you get good pay and benefits because you work in one location, and it doesn't matter what the conditions are of your neighbor or your sister or your brother or friends or family members. We want to actually fight for the working class as a whole. And that means that that when we go into bargaining in an individual workplace, for us, when we negotiate contracts at the U, what we see is that a lot of times members are working for health insurance, right? We've got high quality health insurance at the university where I work because we fought for that as a union and preserved that. And so a lot of people work there because they have mental health issues, because they have chronic health issues, or they have family members who do, and they're concerned about that. But it's also a real power in the hands of the employer when we're in bargaining, because they know that that's the reason that people are there as well, that they're willing to give up a little bit on wages if they have a higher quality health insurance plan. We've been on strike twice in the past 20 years. And the big concern that was raised both times was, what happens if the university cuts off our health insurance, right? And that means that people are afraid, can be afraid to take risks and can be afraid to stand up and fight back. Because of the potential to lose that. On the flip side, we have a power as a union movement to come together and say, we're not just fighting on behalf of ourselves in one workplace, but we're fighting on behalf of our community members, on behalf of our friends and family who might not have a health insurance at their employer that's quality. And instead we can say, we all deserve this. It's not just, we don't want just quality health insurance for our members. We want it for everybody. As Cynthia said, if we lift the floor, if we raise the floor, that improves things for all of us. And that's the type of society that we want to build.
And Ada, that's, that idea that unions are only looking out for themselves and their members, and there's something to be envious of there, has been used by union busters for time immemorial, dividing workers, saying it's not fair that they've got healthcare and you don't. Ergo, rather than, hey, how about we all get healthcare? We gotta break these people down. We gotta make sure that they can't have a decent wage and healthcare for themselves and their families. And unfortunately, that tactic has been successful far too many times.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that we do at Local 11 is that, we build leaders, our leadership, we have structures inside the workplace to make sure that we're able to get our message across and get people to understand that we're bonding together so we can preserve our benefits and we can get out of poverty. And it's having that one conversation at a time with our members to explain to them, no, Medicare for all is a good thing. And when, they can't come after you if everybody has it, it's that same mentality, right? They go after, we've taught our members, they go after one department, we've got to defend them because you're next, right? And it's and they've lived it and they've felt it and they rose and fought for it. And that's the way that we are trying to get our members to think about Medicare for all, right? They're ready to take that out of the equation and figure out what else they can aspire for their families instead of, hanging on to only the healthcare.
Cynthia, how do you, or have you seen concern from members who, buy into the, oh, this is socialism rhetoric? Because I'm sure you speak with all kinds of people with all kinds of different political persuasions. Do you hear that a lot? How do you respond to it? What does that discussion and conversation look like?
Absolutely, we hear that. And one of the things we've done is we have coming out of those conversations that I mentioned earlier that we were having in our listening project, we put together a program where we go to different union meetings when they want us to come, and people have a chance to talk about what are the problems with this, what are you experiencing as problems in the current system, why do you think those problems exist? People get to come up with those answers themselves. They come up with amazingly the same answers as each other. We talk about Medicare for all as a possible solution. That's where we often kind of hear some of those things. And we talk about how it could work and what it really means, and try to get the specifics of what a policy that covered everyone cradle to grave, everybody in, nobody out, means, and separate it from labels that are put on things just to get people to be against them. And we've seen many people move toward the idea through having conversations like that are actually based on the content of what we're talking about doing instead of just that name calling. And we're really excited about, we have members who actually present those programs, and some of those members now are training other members to present that program in the locals. And we haven't got nearly as many as we want, but those programs are so fun every time we get a chance to do it with members.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a brilliant approach, because then people are offering the solutions themselves and coming to that place themselves, which all the research shows is the most effective way to persuade someone, rather than, berating them or hitting them upside the head with all the facts and statistics, as important as they are. If they reflect on their own experiences and the challenges they have, they can sort of walk themselves in the direction of realizing that this is the best possible solution. And Shireen, I've been reflecting a lot this week, and this is related to healthcare, but it's just related to the state of the country in general, on, my God, the divide and the sort of like tribal politics that we see. And I really attribute part of why we've seen such a coming apart to the fact that that the labor union density is so low, because that's really one of the places where you can have those conversations across racial lines, across gender lines, across political ideological lines, so that people feel like they have a sort of common shared experience and common shared goals here. You have been on the front lines, and your union has been on the front lines of the protest movement there in Minnesota. Just reflect on that piece and the way that you've seen those political dialogues unfold, maybe between people who have really polar opposite political views and ideologies and backgrounds.
Well, our union at the University of Minnesota is statewide. There are 5 campuses throughout the state of Minnesota. And with the majority being on the Twin Cities campus, Minneapolis, St. Paul, we have hundreds of members who live in the areas that were most impacted by the uprising after George Floyd was murdered. We also have, a lot of members who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, who have been impacted by they're having friends or family members who have been victims of police brutality, police repression. And we've decided that we just need to take a stand on it and really talk about it as a union. I think that there are a lot of unions who say that we don't want it, that's not a work-related issue, right? That's not something that happens at work, so we don't have to talk about it. But we expect our members as unions, we talk all the time about how we want to have them engaged in politics. We want to have them engaged in things outside the workplace and go to their communities and take the union agenda to their communities. And so it seems ridiculous to me that we wouldn't then take our community's agendas back into the workplace. And so we can't, I think it's a failing of the labor movement at times to refuse to have these conversations. And so as someone who's a white leader of our union, I challenge others who are white and leading in their unions to have conversations and ask your members, do you have you faced this level of repression? Do you have family members there? Because if people think that it didn't affect, that there isn't a level of police brutality that affects our members of color, then you haven't had that conversation, because it means that you really haven't talked to them. After George Floyd was murdered, our members were very, very active in the protests that were going on, and they had been active beforehand as well. We've taken a stance for years on these issues and have been participating in protest movements, and we've had a lot of pushback from other unions, not as much from our membership, but from other unions saying you should just ignore this. But our members played a real leadership role, particularly Black women, in helping to lead the protests and in leading those movements. And we also had a whole initiative where we called and talked to all of our members throughout the state and had real conversations to say, how's this impacting you? What's going on? How do we stand together? And again, our perspective is an injury to one is an injury to all. And that means that this, as a labor movement, it's all of us coming together. And we need to look at the best movements. The best moments of the labor movement were when we have taken a stand as a union for the fights for racial justice. It's when we have moved forward the most. And when we fail to do so is when we actually move backwards. And so I think we've got to flip the script on how we talk about these issues. They need to be central to what we do if we want to survive and thrive as a labor movement.
Ada, I see you nodding your head to a lot of that. Go ahead.
Wow, I'm just, it's so true. It's so true, because how do we, as a labor movement, say, we only care what happens to you while you're working, and then you can be shot, after you get off work. I believe as a labor, and you asked this question earlier, as a labor movement, as unions, we have to care about our members as a whole, a society as a whole. They're just not workers. They go to school, they're parents, there's different parts of us, and we have a responsibility to overall as a society. So I love how you're, Shireen, how you're going about that and how you express that.
And Ada, talk about how you've handled those conversations across political and ideological divides, whether it's on healthcare, whether it's on racial justice or anything else, because, I think, I'll speak for myself here. I don't know that I've had a harder year in terms of even people I really love and like and respect, but being able to maintain a level of sort of civility and honest, good faith engagement in the conversation at times has been extraordinarily difficult. How have you navigated those waters?
Well, I think it has been about building those relationships first that allow us to hold those difficult discussions. I'm at a loss absent those relationships, to be truthful. Within our members, I would say that most of them think very similarly to me, but there are some that don't. And we bring those relationships and the struggles that we've had together. We remind them of that. To reestablish our relationship and the faith that we have, whether it's the organizer or whoever it is that's talking to our members, to have those tough relationships. But, corporate America finds a good way to divide, Black and brown people all the time. And we've had this Black Lives Matter discussion with them prior to to the killing of George Floyd inside the shop for some period of time. So when this happens, when George Floyd happens, it becomes an easier conversation of why we need to safely go to the streets and protest, for example. And then, unfortunately, we also had a killing, of a brown a man, in the hands of the sheriff here in LA.
Mm.
And we rallied with with Black Lives Matter, and we're asking for the sheriff to resign based on that, because he was the son of one of our members. So again, it's not just, it's just when it hits one part of your society, be ready for the rest to come along.
Yeah. I think that's so well said. We were speaking about, Cynthia, and you were speaking very eloquently about specifically, this divide between the idea of like, we're just focusing narrowly on our members while they're at work versus the true concept of solidarity that we're advocating for all working people. Do you think that view is the majority view among union leaders? Do you think that view is ascendant? As we think about, the future of Medicare for all and the future of the labor movement, do you think that is the view that is gaining more dominance within the labor movement?
It's certainly something that we're talking about more, and I think we're seeing it come into action and come into agreement in campaigns around things like the raising of the minimum wage and things like that. That affects some union members, but it affects many more workers who are not union members, because of course union members have in many cases been able to raise their wages beyond that, but unions have come together to work on those causes. And I think that we see this campaign for universal health care to be similar in how it affects everyone, and that there are many union members who have good health care benefits that have been able to be negotiated in their contract, that see the benefit of if good healthcare access was extended throughout their communities, coming together and being willing to work together on that. And we also see that as an issue that, at least so far, even despite which politicians do and don't stand for it, at least so far in our conversations, it's still a conversation that we can have that doesn't immediately jump to party divides or or things like that, that people can still talk about the issue with each other. And as we have those conversations, I think it builds relationship and builds trust for being able to have some of the harder conversations that you've just been talking about. Yeah. And when people express fear of talking about those things because they're divisive, the division's there, and we have to have those conversations or we won't overcome it.
Yeah. Well,
and can I just...
Sure, go ahead, Ada.
Sorry. It's worthwhile, because as it is, you mentioned earlier, we have lost ground in the labor movement. And so, the more that we have those courageous conversations and get uncomfortable with each other, the more we have to gain. And unfortunately, I wish we were further along, but there are a few unions that decide to have a holistic view of their members, and there are others that just can't get there. And I don't know what the solution is, but it would be helpful for us to speak with one voice and be stronger on all these issues.
And Ada, do you see a distinction between is it the particular leaders? Is it the governance structures? Is there any, or the particular industries? Is there any sort of rhyme or reason to that philosophical divide?
I'm sure that there's a little of everything. Sometimes it's philosophical, sometimes it's lack of training, sometimes it's the craft, sometimes it's the low wage workers are just on their own to fend for themselves. I think there's just like a whole bunch of a little of everything of what you just mentioned.
Yeah, a sort of legacy thinking there. Shireen, let me talk to you about, moving forward, what you think the right path is here. We have new administration, thank God, in my view. It's my commentary. I won't require you to sign on to that. We have a new administration coming in, but one that, Joe Biden has said, I will not, even if Medicare for all passed, I would veto it. That's his current position. But that doesn't mean that progress can't be made and that there can't be steps taken to move us in a better direction here. What do you see as sort of the realistic potential under a Biden administration? What are the things that you're most hoping for here?
Well, I think we are living in extraordinary times where, I don't think any of us could have imagined the past year happening. If anyone had been asked what's going to happen in the next year, just a year ago, I think no one had most of these issues on their bingo card. And so I'm always eternally optimistic about what's possible. I'm not optimistic, or what gives me optimism though isn't actually what the perspective is of the politicians in DC, but I'm optimistic because of where people are at. And I think that what the labor movement has shown us is that when people come together and take up a common cause and have a vision of supporting each other, that we can make tremendous change happen. And so I think that that what we have seen, and really the lesson of the Black Lives Matter movement in the past year, and the lesson of workers rising up around issues of healthcare, around PPE and health and safety issues, of the Red for Ed, the teacher uprisings in the year before, is that we can actually change things incredibly in a short amount of time if we come together and we have a vision for that. And so I'm not, I do think that a lot of what President Biden will do is try to be moderate, to try and bridge the divide that exists right now by saying, well, we have to become more conservative in order to appeal to folks, where I actually think what we need to do is have more of a vision that is about uplifting people. Someone here who's Erin Murphy, who's a state senator, who's a nurse, was the head of the nurses union, and has been very active in the Medicare for All movement, talks about having a politics of hope. And I think that's what we need to see, as a politics of hope rather than a politics of hate. But I think that we will not actually accomplish anything if we don't actually carry out struggle and take to the streets as needed to really come forward and create a movement where we put forward demands. I think that if we, as a labor movement, say we need to see movement on this, and that we push the politicians rather than responding to the politicians, that I think that there is some potential there. Do I think that Biden is going to suddenly become a big advocate for Medicare for all? No. But do I think that that if the population pushes it, and we push our politicians and really mandate and say we need this, and use the power that we have as a labor movement in coalition with all of the other community organizations, I think we can make advances and at least get steps towards that.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Cynthia?
Yes, Shireen said it really well, and we won't get Medicare for all until we have a movement that they can't say no to. That's how we got rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so it's that building, it's that understanding, it's that coming to a cultural consensus that includes a broad majority of workers and people in the country demanding certain standards that we won't go below. And that's when the people that we elect will be able to do it. They aren't able actually to do it without us building something like that behind it. It's how we got the gains that we made during the New Deal, was that labor had been demanding a lot. And that's how that came in. And that's what this will require as well, is we have to back them up. We have to elect the ones that at least lean toward it and hopefully that support it, but they can't do it until the movement is behind them.
Yeah. Ada, speak to that, because I think that, one illustrative example here that we've had just recently is the conversation around $2,000 checks, right? First of all, before COVID, the idea of sending the vast majority of Americans just a $2,000 check would have been unheard of. No Republican would have supported it. And now we have some Republicans, at least, who have supported it, including President Trump, who sort of threw it into the mix as a chaos agent. But whatever, he put it on the table. Give him credit for that. And you saw specifically Joe Biden evolve in real time on the issue. He didn't talk much on the campaign trail about direct payments. At the beginning of December, the original deal that was being negotiated didn't include any direct payments, and he had signed on to that to encourage that deal and supported it. Then Sanders and Hawley teamed up and put the idea of direct payments on the table. It moves up to $600, and now the position, totally mainstream in the Democratic Party, supported by everyone to my knowledge, except for Joe Manchin, apparently, is $2,000 payments. Now, look, in my view, it's far too little. It's less than what other developed countries around the world have provided to their people during this unprecedented crisis. But that shows a real movement brought about by the fact that 80% of Americans are behind it. It was just too popular of a political force to possibly resist. So to me, when I saw that willingness to embrace something that was so clearly popular, it gave me a little bit of hope for more progress in this administration that I was maybe expecting previously.
No, it's definitely a great sign. And, I think that despite a pandemic, we were able to get our voices, heard. We spoke out in social media very strongly, and we made sure that there was enough to get that sentiment to change. And, I don't know if it was Cynthia or Shireen that said this, but, we can't lose faith, right? We just can't. We've got to have our eye on the prize and keep pushing as hard as we can. If we hadn't, everybody thought that maybe Georgia was not in the cards for us, right? Both seats. And, I just want to tell you a quick story, because that's what we believe in my union, in my local. Like, Si Se Puede, we sent 1,000 workers who were laid off from all parts of Unite here to knock on doors in a COVID safe way.
Wow.
And we helped make the impossible possible.
Wow.
So, I'm very proud. Prior to that, we were in Arizona helping win and turn Arizona blue. And that was just one person at a time. And, I'm going to repeat what my colleague, Susan Minato says, my co-president. We often think and dismiss that one person, right? But the power of organizing is extraordinary. It's one person that can get another person. That's how we won Arizona, and that's how we won Georgia. So, I don't think anything is off the table. I think we've got to keep talking about it, keep bringing the stories of all these difficulties that Americans are facing. What the way that you're talking and how we elevated the 2000, we're living the same exact thing on the other side of this healthcare thing. So it is an important topic, and we've got to be able to lift our members' voices and, people in the industry that have no union, that have had no benefits. People are afraid to go to the hospital. They're, in the Latino community, in my union, people are not going to the hospital because they think they can't, and they're dying. They're dying. When I get the call, it's like they should have been in the hospital. I'm no doctor, but the doctor says to the family member, you should have brought them 3 days ago, when they're not breathing anymore and they die. It's so difficult. It's so, it's insane that we're living in America, the best country in the world, and our people are dying because of lack of health care.
And Ada, I go ahead, Shireen.
I was actually going to just say that the other thing that I think we have won and changed the dynamic on in the past year is the issue of family leave and having paid paid time off to care for yourselves, to care for your loved ones, to care for your children who are needing to be homeschooled. That's something that would have never been considered a couple of years ago or even a year ago. And suddenly it's there and it's on the table. And so how do we codify those things as well and make sure that they don't just exist in the pandemic, but that they actually stick with us going forward and for everybody?
Yeah. Cynthia, what is your view of, the specific policy plan that's been offered by the Biden administration is extending expanding the public option so that people have a sort of government run alternative. What is your view of that policy? And do you think that that's a potential road to single payer ultimately?
I will say I have not read it in detail. I've just heard the, high level talking points on it. I'm in favor of things that move in that direction, and I think that probably moves in that direction. But my view of those policies are that they don't address the root of the problem, which is that the employer-based healthcare and the for-profit system in our country provide incentives that don't prioritize health over everything else, and provide situations that don't provide security for people when other things around them are becoming insecure. And those are the things that we want. We want it to be affordable and reachable, and we want it to be secure. As I said before, everybody in, nobody out, and cradle to grave. And when we have that, our communities are healthier. I mean, we're seeing that with COVID. If the community was healthy, we wouldn't be passing it around so much. So we all benefit when we all benefit.
Yeah. Ada, let me ask you, so two questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts on public option and if you see that as a sort of pathway forward, like an interim step. And then picking up on that point as well, I think you were the one who raised the structural issue of corporate power, right? And the fact that, we saw this with the Black Lives Matter protest movement, where you have companies like Amazon, they're happy to put BLM on their homepage, but then meanwhile, they're largely Black and brown warehouse workers. They're literally hiring Pinkerton goons to spy on them, and failing to give them the health and the safety and the decent wages and the conditions that they need and deserve. So everything gets extra hard in America the moment that it threatens someone's bottom line. And that's what we're talking about here, right? A lot of people, millions of people would benefit, and a lot of businesses would benefit too, by the way. But you have some very powerful interests that are obviously stacked up against the idea of healthcare provided to everyone in the country. What have we seen that's successful ultimately in fighting back against that kind of entrenched corporate power?
Very little, unfortunately, because look at how powerful they're getting more powerful by the minute. Look at they're so smart. They're able to outsmart us in every step of the way. All these multi-million-dollar corporations. There was for example, there was PPP money that was offered, for small businesses. And what did large, big corporations, hotel industries do? They went after the money instead of having it for, the small businesses. They went after the money to supposedly keep, employees on, and they didn't. And instead they got a very cheap loan. So we keep enabling that, politicians and, the lack of vote, we've got to fight really hard to make sure that our communities, that our workers are voting for their interests, not against their interests. And that's one of the issues. But I also believe in the power of protest. Peaceful civil disobedience has been the cornerstone of, what my union has taught me, and just being relentless, not giving up. I'm so proud that I get to every single day fight alongside, women, courageous women and men who decide to take on multi-million-dollar corporations and win. And despite this pandemic, we keep growing. We have doubled our size in the last 11 years. We've won 3 large properties in the middle of a pandemic. So of course they're not working, but we're recognized in the minute that we're that they go back into the workplace. And I think in 2 of those cases, we've already signed agreements.
Wow.
So I think it's, understanding our personal power that we have, and trusting that together we're able to make things happen. And as far as your first question, I also believe that any progress, towards this broken system is important. And even if it's not enough, it's the move in the right direction. And we could, even if it takes for, a long period of time, we should do it. I come from a union that that was fighting this particular hotel for 30 years.
Wow.
30 years, and we finally won. We had one or two workers who were still there.
Victory.
So, and so, many people, when they came to LA, or, leaders from the past, just so many people were part of that campaign that it was
Wow.
so, great. So
that's amazing. I wanted to ask you, Ada, it's really interesting that you say, you've seen a lot of success in being able to organize during the pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic has in fact helped with that, in a sense of making the case really clear why you need to be part of a union, why you need to have, this concept of solidarity and someone having your back? Or, have you been seeing a growth in interest prior to the pandemic as well? Has it shifted things for you?
we had already began some of these prior to the pandemic. Maybe one of them we had not, but in the first, before the election started, before we went to Arizona and Georgia, we were moving things forward. We obviously stopped for a little bit, but we're retaking back. I think is the fact that people have been home. We're able to find more people at home. We're able to have one-on-one conversations in a COVID safe way that is helpful, and they feel up in the air. They're not going to work. They know the employer they don't have any protections. They know that they're not going to go back unless someone has their back. We've seen the industry, after 9/11 and after the recession, get rid of, people who had been there for decades. And then when the industry comes back up, the employees don't come back.
Yeah.
They let them go for new employees. So what we've been doing is making sure that we're passing legislation in city councils, and we're going to also do it in California, generally in California, of recall retention, to make sure that people who have been there for decades get to return back, after being gone a year and a half, whenever we're ready to return. But they're already in a existential crisis, and all they want is to go back to normality at some point.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
It is. It's really tough.
Shireen, let me have you close things out here. And the question I wanted to ask you was, you have young people in general overwhelmingly in favor of Medicare for all, and also extraordinarily in favor of unions, but there's less connectivity between that generation and an actual, sort of like there's less of a direct connection to the labor movement and understanding of the history there, and understanding of the present, and the absolute essential need, in my view, for the labor movement to grow and expand in order to achieve some priorities like Medicare for all. How do you see that struggle, and how does it relate to ultimately where we need to go on single payer healthcare?
I am extraordinarily positive and optimistic about where young people are at today. And having participated in the protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and seeing so many, it was young people that were out in huge numbers. I work at the university, and thousands of students from the university participated, high school students, middle-aged students. There were marches of grade school kids, right, that were organized organizing themselves. It wasn't that their parents were doing this, it was that these were kids. And what was remarkable was that it's generations of young people saying, we stand together, that my interests are actually in fighting against racism as a white young person, or as a Latina or Latino, or as an Indigenous person or an Asian person, that fighting for Black Lives Matter was something that they saw as critical. And I saw that around the country. And so that's a perspective that the labor movement needs to really take up in greater degree, and say, this movement that you've been fighting as part of, that's what we are calling for as a labor movement, that my interests are with my community members and my neighbors, and in fighting racism, and that my interest is not actually in the same as the corporation that I might work for, right? They're saying, let's all just sacrifice together. Like you take your turn and sacrifice on behalf of the good of the company, rather than the company thinking they should be standing by their workforce during this pandemic. And so we see all of these young people who've come together and are fighting side by side for each other and for a better future. And I think that's really hopeful to me, for people to come into the labor movement, because I think it's also a group of people who, as they enter the workforce, they're going to know the power that they have collectively in standing up and fighting back. And that's good for the labor movement. Even if they might not have a family history of being in a union, but they have a personal history of standing up as a community. And so we can really build on that. And I think that also, in light of the pandemic, the whole way the healthcare system operates is just exposed, right? It is just ludicrous. And I think that it's pretty easy to see that. And so again, I think young people coming forward and standing up, I have a great deal of hope that they see what's wrong with the system and they have ideas for fixing it. So I think we just need to, in a lot of ways, just get out of the way and let new generations come in and build a society that's really, really one that we want.
That's such a profound point, and one I hadn't exactly thought about, which is that was the living, breathing definition of solidarity. Like, there's an intuitive, visceral understanding that's really hopeful. And I had a hope that you might leave us on an optimistic note. Ladies, it's such an honor to speak with all three of you. You're all so incredibly courageous and have done so much to make people's lives better. Which is just, I mean, that's an incredible thing. So thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Of course.